The cold January wind pushed through the automatic sliding doors of JFK Airport, carrying with it the murmured chaos of arrivals, scattered languages, and the metallic echo of rolling suitcases. It was 5:42 p.m., the evening rush when the terminal feels like a living organism, pulsing with movement and noise. Above the crowd, an arrival board flickered as Flight SU-102 from Moscow Sheremetyevo marked itself with a dull, almost anticlimactic word: landed. Yet for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, this was no ordinary arrival. On the mezzanine overlooking immigration, two plainclothes agents leaned on the railing with the kind of stillness that only long surveillance work can teach. They were tired, hungry, and tense, and the silence between them was filled with the unspoken knowledge that the next few minutes would determine the success of a 2-year counterintelligence operation. Below them, the passengers from SU-102 spilled out in slow waves, some disoriented, others impatient, and many exhausted from the long transatlantic flight. Families united with tearful embraces. Business travelers rushed for taxis. Students looked around nervously, clutching backpacks filled with hopes and anxieties. But one man moved differently. He emerged from the stream with the posture of a person who had survived too many interrogations, too many border crossings, and too many lies. His name was Viktor Sokolov, 46 years old, former intelligence analyst for the Soviet Committee for State Security, classified courier for Directorate S, and for the past 3 months, an increasingly desperate man sending coded messages through Western channels claiming he wanted out. Defection. It was a word that echoed across entire governments, capable of reshaping alliances, ending careers, and altering the balance of global intelligence. A Soviet defector was a living archive of secrets, and the KGB hunted such people with a devotion bordering on religious. They did not forgive traitors. They did not forget them. They did not let them escape. Sokolov stepped forward into the immigration line, pulling the collar of his outdated trench coat tight around his neck. In his right hand, he held a worn leather briefcase, the kind government workers carried during the Brezhnev years. His knuckles were pale, squeezed tight around the handle. Inside that briefcase, the FBI believed, were the first documents he intended to trade for asylum. Architectural maps of Leningrad's communication grid, internal memoranda from Directorate S, perhaps even names. He lifted his eyes, scanning the corridor with a veteran's instinct for danger. He had been studied relentlessly by the FBI, analyzed in conference rooms, printed on slides, displayed on corkboards. But this was the first time they saw him in person. And in that single glance upward, Agent Richard Hale felt a chill. Viktor Sokolov already knew he was in trouble. Hale signaled with the most subtle motion of his hand. 3 other agents detached themselves from the crowd like shadows peeling away from a wall. The operation was meant to look casual, almost mundane. But behind the glass partitions, behind the civilian clothes and tired expressions, there was the unmistakable current of a coming storm. When Sokolov finally stepped forward to the immigration counter, the agent scanned his passport, frowned, scanned again, and typed something with deliberate slowness. Sokolov leaned forward. His breathing changed. He sensed it. The trap was closing. 2 FBI agents moved in from behind. Another stepped in from the side. The immigration officer looked up and nodded. "Sir, please come with us." Sokolov froze. For 3 seconds he stared at the officer, then at the agents, and then at the illuminated ceiling as if calculating every possible outcome. In that moment, a man who had spent his life navigating the labyrinth of espionage realized his final mistake. He had chosen the wrong moment to run. The briefcase slipped from his fingers. The agents took him by the arms. The crowd parted around them, not understanding the significance of what they were witnessing. And at 5:46 p.m., under the indifferent lights of JFK Airport Terminal 4, the United States quietly captured the Soviet Union's newest would-be defector. The story did not begin here, but this was where the facade finally shattered. Before he was a man being led in handcuffs through JFK Airport, Viktor Sokolov was an ordinary citizen in the Soviet Union. Or at least, he had pretended to be ordinary for so long that he nearly believed it. His apartment in Leningrad was the type assigned to mid-tier civil servants, cramped, aging, perpetually damp in winter. The wallpaper peeled in corners, and the scent of boiled cabbage and cold metal lingered in the hallways. He lived alone, though he had once shared the space with his ex-wife, Larisa, and their daughter, Marina. They had left 5 years earlier during one of the long stretches where Viktor's work demanded secrecy, silence, and unpredictable absences. Officially, Directorate S required devotion. Unofficially, they demanded the sacrifice of one's humanity. Viktor had been an analyst first, tasked with parsing the dense transcripts of intercepted communications. Later, he became a courier for sensitive materials, a role requiring absolute loyalty and an ability to keep secrets so heavy they bent the mind. He traveled between Leningrad, Moscow, and occasional border towns where messages and packages passed hands under coded greetings. His life was built entirely around things he could never say. But the truth was simpler. Viktor was tired. The Soviet system had worn him down until he existed in a dull twilight of moral exhaustion. He had seen friends disappear after internal reviews. He had witnessed political purges disguised as bureaucratic reorganizations. He had spent too many nights staring at the frost on his window, wondering when the machinery of the state would turn its gaze on him. His descent into espionage had not begun with ideology or money. It began with loneliness. A loneliness so deep that it created an internal hollow the KGB filled with duty, secrecy, and fear. But Viktor's story changed the day he found an opportunity he should have ignored, a file he should have left untouched. Instead, he saw in it a glimmer of leverage, a ticket to a new life. A dangerous seed was planted, a longing he tried to deny, a thought that grew into treason. It happened quietly. All betrayals begin that way. The moment Viktor stepped across the line between loyalty and betrayal, there was no dramatic turning point, no epiphany, no grand ideological awakening. It was a whisper, a thought flickering in a moment of weakness. He had been assigned to deliver a classified technical dossier from Leningrad to a secure KGB site in Moscow. The file was routine enough not to raise suspicion, but sensitive enough that mishandling it meant prison. Normally, Viktor would have followed protocol, but that day, he paused. The folder was unsealed, as was the practice for internal transfer. Inside were schematics of a communications grid used by Soviet naval intelligence. Valuable, understandable. The kind of document Western agencies would salivate over. But for Viktor, it represented something else. An exit, a bargaining chip. Proof that he still existed in a world rapidly shrinking around him. He took photographs. He sealed the folder. He delivered it as instructed. And then he waited in the shadows for consequences that never came. The success of that tiny act emboldened him. Over the next year, he copied more documents. Always careful, always precise, always balancing on a technicality thin enough to break under the weight of a single mistake. Eventually, he found a discreet way to pass anonymous hints toward Western diplomats. Small signals that someone inside the Soviet apparatus was willing to talk. Someone who wished to defect. CIA stations in Europe noticed. They sent encrypted brightness-coded responses. They tried to identify the ghost reaching out to them through half-formed channels. But Viktor hesitated, not out of fear, but out of pride. He wanted his defection to be dramatic. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be valued. He wanted the world to know that he had mattered. That ego was the first crack, the one that eventually destroyed him. The first meeting between Viktor Sokolov and the people who would eventually become his Western handlers did not take place at a dead drop, or in a dark alley, or under a bridge at midnight. It happened in a hotel restaurant with a pianist playing an uneven rendition of a Chopin nocturne, and with the lingering scent of stale tobacco twisting through the heavy air. The meeting had been orchestrated through a sequence of vague signals, exchanged through intermediaries who themselves were unaware of the exact nature of the contact. The diplomat who sat across from Victor appeared calm, even casual, swirling a glass of mineral water as if they were old acquaintances reunited after many years. But Victor was rigid. His fingers were locked together on the table as if he feared they might betray him if left alone. Their conversation began with meaningless sentences, comments about the bitter winter, observations about the pianist's lack of technique, a polite exchange about whether the service in this aging hotel had improved over the years. But beneath each sentence was a deeper language, a coded dance designed to test Victor's resolve and measure his credibility. It was never what they said aloud that mattered. It was the subtle choices of phrasing, the tone of voice, the slight pauses, and even the micro-expressions that flickered across Victor's face. The diplomat smiled frequently, but the smile never reached his eyes. He was studying Victor with the intensity of a surgeon examining tissue for signs of disease. When Victor finally leaned forward and whispered the first truly dangerous sentence he had ever spoken, the pianist was still playing. The waiter was still polishing a glass nearby. The other diners were still talking about nothing of consequence. But that single sentence changed Victor's life. The diplomat's eyes narrowed slightly, and he placed his glass down with deliberate care. From that moment, the handlers moved quietly into Victor's existence. They arranged subsequent meetings in increasingly controlled environments. They taught him the protocol of coded greetings. They instructed him in the careful use of casual phrases that carried deeper meanings. They introduced the concept of compartmentalization, urging him to isolate different fragments of information in different mental boxes so that he could survive interrogation should the worst ever occur. At their dinners, Victor began to receive subtle tests. A seemingly innocent question about his department's internal memos, a comment about a Soviet naval project that required him to correct the details, a request for clarification about specific terminology used by Directorate S. None of it appeared threatening at first. None of it seemed connected to espionage. It felt like a casual intellectual exchange between two men who happened to move in similar circles. But as the months progressed, the diplomat's requests evolved. The tone softened, then hardened, then softened again in a methodical pattern designed to wear down Victor's resistance and heighten his dependence on the attention they gave him. They invited him to more dinners. They offered him foreign cigarettes he had never tasted before. They poured imported whiskey into clean glasses and waited for him to speak. Each meeting was an act of grooming, the systematic construction of a psychological dependency that Victor mistook for respect. For the first time in years, he felt seen. He felt important. He felt as though his knowledge held real weight. He mistook manipulation for validation and gratitude for personal connection. That was the subtle brilliance of it. By the time the handlers began making explicit requests, Victor was already too emotionally invested to walk away. The first explicit request was the smallest one possible. A single file. Nothing critical. Nothing explosive. Nothing that would arouse suspicion. But once Victor delivered it, they praised him gently, like a teacher with a student who had finally shown potential. Then came larger requests, maps of communications networks, internal personnel records, analysis reports from departments Victor had once believed no one cared about. Each time he complied, they rewarded him with compliments, with attention, with the sense that he had finally become someone whose thoughts mattered. They subtly reminded him of the loneliness he carried, the failures that had hollowed him out, the broken marriage, the quiet resentment he held toward a system that had devoured his best years without offering anything in return. And without realizing it, Victor allowed them to plant the idea of defection as though it were his own. By the end of that year, Victor no longer needed persuasion. He asked for the meetings. He volunteered information before they requested it. He had become both a source and a man intoxicated with the dangerous illusion of agency. And in the shadows of the hotel restaurant, beneath the static hum of Soviet lights, the handlers saw him not as a human being, but as a tool with an expiration date. In the months that followed, Victor lived two parallel lives. In one, he was still the dutiful Soviet analyst with impeccable attendance, predictable routines, and a demeanor that revealed nothing. In the other, he moved like a man carrying invisible explosives in his pockets, trembling under the pressure of secrets that could bury him alive. He became hyper-aware of every sound in his stairwell, every unexpected knock on his door, every co-worker's casual glance. His mind began to fracture under the weight of constant caution. He started taking longer routes home, choosing paths that made no logical sense. He stopped riding the metro on certain days, claiming illness to avoid packed cars full of unknown eyes. He practiced observing reflections in shop windows, trying to detect whether the same silhouette appeared more than once. Sometimes he believed he saw someone following him. Sometimes he convinced himself he imagined everything. The paranoia was both a survival instinct and a slow poison that eroded what little stability he had left. At work, Victor's hands shook when he handled classified documents. He tried to steady himself by gripping the edges of the table, but the tremor persisted. His supervisors noticed his tension. They watched him linger too long at filing cabinets. They observed the slight delay in his responses when asked routine questions. The KGB was a machine that detected anomalies the way a sensitive instrument detects vibrations, and Victor had begun to vibrate at a frequency that signaled danger. His handlers urged him to stay calm. They told him that paranoia was normal in their line of work. They assured him that the KGB had no reason to suspect him. But behind their calm exterior, they saw the same warning signs he did. Victor was unraveling. Once a source begins to fray emotionally, the risk of exposure increases exponentially. And yet they continued to feed his anxiety, because an anxious asset was often more obedient than a confident one. At home, Victor slept poorly. He would wake in the early hours of the morning drenched in sweat, his heart pounding from dreams that blended interrogation rooms with memories of his daughter. He imagined KGB officers at his door. He imagined footsteps on the stairs. He imagined himself dragged from his apartment with his neighbors watching in silence. The psychological toll became a constant companion, whispering to him throughout the day and keeping him company during long nights of wakefulness. Victor told himself he could endure it, that the rewards were worth the risk, that defection was within reach. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was becoming predictable, and predictability was fatal. While Victor was succumbing to desperation in Leningrad, the FBI and CIA were conducting an increasingly coordinated intelligence effort to identify the anonymous Soviet officer who was attempting to make contact. The messages he sent were vague, as they needed to be, but the patterns were consistent enough that analysts began to narrow the field. Cross-referencing internal Soviet communications, embassy activities, and known Directorate S movements, they constructed a profile of the man they believed was reaching out. When Victor eventually delivered his first physical package, routed through a complex chain of couriers, the FBI finally had tangible evidence. It was not enough to identify him by name, but it was enough to know he was real and that he possessed access to sensitive materials. The agency began pouring resources into the effort, establishing surveillance channels, monitoring diplomatic interactions, and coordinating with European allies. The CIA station in Vienna flagged several peculiar patterns in Soviet diplomatic travel. MI6 in London offered background data on Directorate S courier patterns, But the most important discovery came from a decrypted transmission intercepted from a Soviet relay facility. The transmission was vague, cautionary in tone, and mentioned the possibility of an internal leak. It was just enough to suggest that the KGB was beginning to sense something was amiss. The FBI realized they were now racing against an enemy that would respond with brutality if they identified the traitor first. The counterintelligence investigation grew more intense. Meetings were held late into the night, with analysts hunched over files, connecting dots, and updating their internal models of the unknown asset. They believed he wanted to defect. They believed he was preparing to flee the Soviet Union. But they did not know when, how, or whether he was already compromised. Internal memos circulated with increasing urgency. Supervisors demanded near-constant updates. Agents were deployed to monitor airports, border crossings, and embassy functions. Every scrap of information that entered the system was examined for relevance. And as the intelligence picture sharpened, they realized that the asset was becoming reckless, sending increasingly frequent communications that suggested he was feeling the noose tighten around his neck. The FBI could not protect a man whose name they did not know, but they could prepare for the moment he made his move. And they knew that when he did, he would come to the United States. He would choose America as his final destination. And when that happened, they needed to be ready. They did not expect he would choose to fly directly into their arms. The final days before Victor's attempted escape were marked by a level of chaos he had never experienced. The KGB conducted a surprise audit of several departments within Directorate S, a routine measure on the surface, but one that sent a wave of fear through the corridors. They questioned analysts about document access. They reviewed logs. They scrutinized inconsistencies. They called individuals into private rooms for seemingly benign interviews that were in reality precise psychological tests designed to detect stress responses. When they questioned Victor, he maintained his composure for the first 10 minutes. He answered calmly, his voice steady, his posture relaxed. But then the officer leaned closer, lowered his tone, and asked a question about a file Victor had copied months earlier. The question itself was harmless, but the timing was not. Something in the officer's eyes told Victor that they were closing in. That night, Victor made the decision he had been postponing. He took out the briefcase he had kept hidden in his wardrobe, placed the documents inside, wrapped the handle in cloth to muffle the sound, and sat at his kitchen table staring at the chipped ceramic mug in front of him. The silence in the room felt oppressive. The radiator clanked intermittently, a reminder of the decaying infrastructure that had come to symbolize everything he resented about the state he had served. He wrote a note to his daughter, a short message filled with vague apologies and assurances that she would someday understand. He knew she would not. He knew this choice would haunt her forever. But the illusion of explanation comforted him in the moment. He left the apartment before dawn, choosing a side entrance to avoid any neighbors who might ask questions. The air was frigid. Snowflakes drifted in lazy spirals as he walked toward the metro station. Every sound behind him felt amplified. He imagined footsteps even when none were there. He imagined eyes watching him from shadows. But he kept walking. At the airport, he presented his documents. The agent looked at them longer than usual. Victor felt the blood drain from his face. But after a moment, the agent stamped them and handed them back. He boarded the flight with trembling hands, convinced that the KGB would appear at any moment and drag him away. They did not, and that was his final mistake. He took their silence as safety, when in reality it meant something else entirely. The KGB already knew he was fleeing. They wanted to see where he would run. When the plane touched down in New York, Victor believed he had survived the most dangerous part of his journey. The cabin lights flickered on, and the passengers stood to retrieve their belongings. Victor sat frozen in his seat for a long moment, paralyzed by the realization that he had entered the final stage of his escape. He stepped onto American soil with the hope that he would be welcomed, debriefed, and escorted into a new life where he could breathe without fear. But the FBI agents waiting for him did not see a heroic defector arriving with secrets. They saw an unknown individual carrying sensitive documents into a civilian airport. They saw potential danger. They saw someone whose intentions were unclear, and they had orders to intercept him before anyone else could. As Victor passed through the immigration corridor, he felt something shift in the air. He sensed the attention turning toward him. He noticed a man lingering against the wall, pretending to read a newspaper. He saw another standing near a vending machine, looking at nothing in particular. When he reached the counter, the immigration officer scanned his passport and paused. A long pause. Too long. The officer asked him to wait. Then he asked him to step aside. Then the agents moved in. When they grabbed his arms, Victor did not resist. He did not shout. He did not protest. He simply felt hollow. The briefcase hit the floor. Papers shifted inside. A faint whisper of air escaped as the latch pressed against the linoleum. He looked around at the crowd, at the indifferent faces watching the scene unfold without understanding its gravity. For a moment, he wondered if the KGB would appear, stepping out from behind the wall with cold eyes and a warrant for his arrest. But instead, it was the FBI who took him, escorting him through a series of corridors into a secure room where fluorescent lights hummed and the smell of antiseptic lingered. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed louder than any prison gate. Victor believed he had escaped one empire. But in that room, surrounded by strangers who saw him as a threat, he realized something far more devastating. He had entered another. The interrogation began quietly. The agents introduced themselves, their tone measured and professional. They offered Victor water. They told him that he was safe. But Victor's mind had already slipped into panic. He spoke too quickly. He contradicted himself. He claimed he was defecting but provided no coherent narrative. He insisted the KGB was after him but had no proof. His anxiety made him sound unhinged rather than credible. The agents opened his briefcase. Documents spilled across the table. Classified Soviet materials, maps, memoranda, technical schematics, evidence of espionage. But instead of clarity, the documents created more confusion. Why had he carried them into the United States instead of delivering them through secure channels abroad? Why had he not used the established protocols defectors typically followed? Why had he flown directly into a major airport with materials that could trigger an international incident? As Victor's story unraveled under questioning, the agents realized the truth. He had panicked. He had not coordinated with the CIA. He had not followed any logical defection pathway. He had simply run. And because he had run without guidance, he had exposed himself, his handlers, and every piece of intelligence he carried. Worse, the KGB had allowed him to flee. They had tracked him. They had monitored his movements. They had likely planted misinformation in the documents he carried. Victor had walked directly into a trap without realizing it. And now the FBI was left holding the wreckage of a defection attempt that was doomed from the moment it began. At one point, Victor broke down, burying his face in his hands, whispering that he had nowhere left to go. The agents watched silently. They saw not a master spy, but a broken man driven by fear, pride, and desperation. A man who had betrayed his country for reasons he could no longer articulate. A man who had come to the United States seeking salvation, only to find bureaucracy, suspicion, and disappointment. The failed defection became a case study in intelligence circles, a reminder that not every spy is a mastermind. Some are simply ordinary men swept into currents they do not understand. The aftermath unfolded with clinical efficiency. The United States determined that the documents Victor carried were contaminated. Some were genuine. Others were altered. A few contained deliberate falsehoods designed to mislead Western intelligence. The The FBI concluded that Victor had been under surveillance by the KGB long before he fled, and that his information could not be trusted. He was charged with violating federal statutes regarding the illegal transport of classified foreign materials. He was held in a secure facility while prosecutors built their case. The trial was swift. The defense argued that Victor had acted out of fear, not malice. They painted him as a man trying to escape systemic oppression, but the prosecution emphasized the recklessness of his actions. The judges saw a man whose presence threatened diplomatic stability, not a celebrated defector. He was sentenced to federal prison. His hopes of a new life disintegrated in a courtroom filled with strangers. His daughter in Leningrad received a brief official notice that her father had been detained abroad. She never saw him again. She grew up believing he had abandoned her. She married. She had children. And she carried a silent resentment that never faded. Victor served his sentence quietly. No published memoir, no interviews, no renown. Just a gradual fading into obscurity. He died years later, his story known only to a handful of intelligence officers who understood the tragedy of it all. In the world of espionage, some betrayals reshape nations, others are forgotten. Viktor Sokolov became a ghost, not because he intended to be one, but because he was consumed by the forces he tried to outrun. His arrest at JFK Airport remained a footnote in the Cold War, a reminder that even in the world of spies, human weakness is the most dangerous enemy of all. If you found this story compelling and want to explore more true Cold War espionage cases, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Your support helps us continue uncovering hidden files, forgotten agents, and stories long buried in the shadows of history. Like, share, and leave a comment to tell us from where are you watching this video.